Following the duo's daring escape from Knives' airship in Volume 8, Nicholas D. Wolfwood and Vash the Stampede regroup with their allies. After 8 months of agony at the hands of Knives, the people trapped on this horrendous planet finally get a fighting chance as they learn that the long-lost Earth fleet is on its way, meaning that humanity is coming to save their brethren who have been stranded on this near-lifeless desert world from their suffering and their enemy. As a result, the people of the wasteland must defeat Knives before their unsuspecting allies arrive to a hailstorm of blades and death. While Vash recovers so that he can fight for absolution and the fate of mankind, Wolfwood remembers his conversation with Ludia in Volume 3 and decides to leave to fight his own battle. The orphanage he was raised in is being used by one of Knives' men as a source of fresh recruits for the Order of Assassins known as the Eyes of Michael, having successfully turned Wolfwood's old friend Levo into a heartless tool of murder. To save the children and his only home, Wolfwood races to confront his past, Levo the Doublefang, the man who trained them both, the original Chapel, and the other experts in the art of killing. The world may be crashing down around them, but Wolfwood trusts Vash and is set on protecting what he holds dear to him without reward or recognition. Volumes 9 and 10 of Trigun Maximum, titled LR and Wolfwood, no idea what LR stands for, it might be a reference to the anime, focus almost exclusively on Nicholas D. Wolfwood and his struggle, his suffering, his development, and his complexities built up throughout the entire series. As the star of the arc, Wolfwood is mostly removed from the bizarre powers and large scales of the other storylines. Instead, the action scenes use every single trick in Wolfwood's arsenal as he battles against the odds in what is basically a 2-volume-long action blockbuster. The arc proper opens with Wolfwood crashing his motorcycle through gates while firing on the cyborg bounty hunters with his handgun. That is the most action movie thing that could be done, and it's a good moment that sets the stage for everything that comes up later. Despite some of the massive amounts of science fiction thrown in, it's a western shootout of brutal, rapid assaults countered by unflinching lunacy between Levo and Wolfwood. As for the villains, Master Chapel and Levo the Doublefang, they are far from the most compelling characters in this manga. They do work though, and there is at least some interesting things mentioned about them. Chapel puts up an incredible fight considering he's in a wheelchair and his body is almost certainly starting to break down due to his rapid aging. His feats in these volumes aren't as impressive as his previous showings, but Chapel provides an utterly hateful voice against Wolfwood that the story needs given Levo's lack of emotion. His most unique and interesting trait compared to other evil mentor type characters is how extreme he is in his desire to make Wolfwood a heartless killer. Wolfwood was trained to be as ruthless and as vicious as possible. Earlier flashbacks showed his handlers shot him in the leg so that he would learn how to move and fight with his mobility being limited after he mastered the basics. That's how extreme his training was, which explains why Wolfwood is so brutal in most of his encounters. And while Wolfwood's fighting style and general attitude reflects that efficient violence, it's not enough. We see Wolfwood battling with unfeeling efficiency in order to ensure his opponents don't fight back, while also not killing them. This is an absolute insult to Chapel, who is actually starting to cry when he realizes that Wolfwood has humanity and compassion. That's how passionate he is into making Wolfwood and Levo into the perfect warriors. And that's not even the most extreme thing he's done for their training. Chapel doesn't even like Wolfwood. He fully plans on torturing him, killing everyone he's ever loved, and then putting him down. But he can't stand to see the assassin arts being wasted, even by a man who stole his identity and tried to murder his cult's icon. Chapel is religiously obsessed with both his mentor role and seeing his students succeed, and the arc efficiently presents that idea. As mentioned in previous volumes, Levo was Wolfwood's childhood friend. And despite his humble beginnings, there was a very clear instability within Levo that seems to have been eradicated as the result of his training and his newfound stoic attitude, which might be the reason why he's so loyal to the Eye of Michael while Wolfwood isn't. Following orders gives him some focus and stability. He also has one of the most ridiculous weapons in the entire manga. Levo's double fangs, the thing he's named after, are 2 submachine guns shaped like crucifixes that can fire from 4 different directions at the same time. It is amazing that there are panels where this looks genuinely intimidating, which is also due to Levo's sheer size and how durable he is, the latter being the result of the same training Wolfwood went under in addition to other extreme means. The other is just that he's insanely tall and intimidating by nature. Levo's near-mindless loyalty might also be tied to his connection to the final member of the Gung Ho Guns. The Trip of Death and their true identity was foreshadowed slightly quite a long time ago, but Trigun Maximum does cheat in some scenes to hide that identity and make you think it's something else entirely. Now, the Gung Ho Guns were a gaggle of strange and inhuman killers. I'm still coming to terms with what Grey the Nine Lives actually was in the end. The group contained a puppeteer, a jazz musician, a collection of insects inside a human host, which is still running around somewhere, and whatever EG9 was meant to be. Possibly an evil tennis ball. Please keep that in mind when I say what the Trip in Death entails, what that title actually represents, is outlandish by this manga's standards. It is quite possibly the stupidest thing to appear in any series I have reviewed so far, and the character's design is only slightly above that. It looks like something inspired by a 1992 X-Men comic inside of a manga. I reject the possibility that the revelation about the Trip of Death sounds better in Japanese. There are some odd grammar and word choice in the series, especially in Volume 10, but that one is beyond the pale. It's not the strange, slightly poetic style that comes up in these other volumes and this one as well. It's just ridiculous. Fortunately, the Trip of Death is actually an interesting personality. Normally this type of brute is just a psychopath with no behaviour beyond their own bloodlust. The Trip is different. Expressing a full range of emotion, having genuine relationships with other characters, and a very clear self-awareness about their own brutality. Even though they enjoy killing people and hurting them, the character is firmly aware of the problems caused by their violent nature, and Night Owl finds interesting ways of showing that brutality and talent in the art of killing, especially in how they act for the other villains. It makes for a good antagonist, especially when put against Wolfwood. The Trip of Death's slow descent onto the battlefield with grace over 20 silent pages like he's the messiah of murder should not be as effective as it is, especially because of the name, but it is actually really impressive. As stated earlier, the arc is almost pure action, defined by loud gunfire and bullets tearing through flesh as blood splatters on the hot desert sand. This means that the art has to carry the story, and its impact when talking isn't an option, although there are around 5 different narrators who help explain things from different perspectives. For the most part, Night Owl captures the frantic pace and chaotic nature that comes from at least 3 different automatic weapons being fired at once. There's an increased reliance on taking cover and reacting or predicting the other side's moves, and it mostly works to capture the speed of events, but there are still some moments that are difficult to follow because the art doesn't convey motion and the body proportions make it hard to tell how the characters are moving. Especially the kicks. I don't think Night Owl has much experience in drawing people kicking each other, but he decided to have that be a major part of Levo's fighting style, and it always looks bad. There's an attempt to use screen tones for shadows that also just looks awful. That might just be the printing of the volumes, though. Honestly, there are some images that look like they would read better if they were completely flat on the table instead of having the spine of a book interfering with them, meaning that Trigun Maximum might be a better read digitally if an official digital version of the manga comes out at some point. But Night Owl gets everything he can out of Wolfwood's weaponry while he can, including addressing the failures and weaknesses of some of his tools. I don't think I have ever seen a handgun used like this, used the way it is used by Wolfwood in Volume 10. It's very, very creative and impressive. While the action is effectively fast-paced and very creative, some of it in the first act is rushed along to allow the manga to reach the next stage of the conflict. And while I do feel that the ending of the arc suffers from Night Owl's ideas and ambitions clashing with his actual drawing ability once again, the final devastating attack is both amazing and strongly presented. The end result is visceral, emotional, and brings everything together for the beautiful ending of the volume. Which is honestly the strength of Yasuhiro Night Owl at this point. Even though his action has improved over time, it still has its faults. He is very good at conveying tone and emotion. This might not be as dark as Volume 8, but there are a lot of pitch black inks and more blood than the series has ever used before in this fight, becoming a dirtier, painful affair. The amount of bloodshed is actually a minor plot point. Wolfwood is in a lot of pain during this arc, and the suffering the main cast goes through is presented so well, as are the small moments of hope and warmth peeking out through their exhausted eyes. From the eyes to the animalistic teeth and the images of people struggling in the dirt perfectly demonstrates what this storyline is about. This arc of Trigun Maximum continues my belief that when there is no action in this action series, it is a very well written and illustrated series. It's when the bullets start flying that the problems appear, but the strength of the dialogue, the characterization, and the framing of the conversations are usually fantastic. I'm not an expressive person. There are 2 points in this arc where I almost cry every single time I read them. All this emotion and the creator's skill are evident through Wolfwood's character arc, through the whole storyline, including the smaller moments that are actually subtle hints towards his changing attitudes, which is why Levo works despite his limited personality and role within the story so far. He is a device used to explore Wolfwood's compassion, and he works in that role. Which is the important thing about Wolfwood. Despite the harshness of his actions and his mysterious, secretive nature throughout most of the story, he is ultimately a good person. He always tries to do the noble thing, even if his doubts, fears, and training make him into a much more violent, almost animalistic person as well, which Night Owl manages to capture. This aggression and desperation is presented wonderfully throughout the whole arc. And it's not a new element, it's appeared in pretty much every fight Wolfwood has gotten into throughout the whole series. But because he opened up to Vash in Volume 8 and got the answer to his driving question about redemption, Wolfwood is trying to be better, using Vash's influence in addition to his own methods to become a gentler soul, even if it's not immediately obvious. This would also explain why his attempts to sound cool in Volume 9 fall flat on their face at first. That's what Vash did all the time during his original adventures. Despite Vash mostly being absent from his own series at this point, this is a very good encapsulation of his relationship with Wolfwood, and maybe even Trigun's opinions on people in general. Despite the inclusion and frequent neglect of Millie and Meryl throughout the entire series, the strained partnership and friendship of Vash the Stampede and Nicholas D. Wolfwood has been at the heart of this story, alongside their mission to stop knives. There has been so much tension and mistrust between Vash and Wolfwood for so long, and there have been times where Wolfwood can't stand to look at Vash. But here, it's very clear that they are closer than they are different. partly because Wolfwood is changing to become more like Vash, and partly because he might have always been closer to him than they ever knew. If you thought that Wolfwood's heartfelt speech about his past at the end of Volume 8 meant that there weren't going to be any more revelations about him, you were wrong. There is a beautiful sequence that completely redefines Vash and Wolfwood's friendship and why Vash makes Nicholas so angry. But it feels completely earned and justified instead of a forced way of making a character sympathetic after he's committed some troubling actions for the sake of his goals. Trigun is a story that asks if people can change, and if they can change for the better instead of the universe simply breaking them. Vash has always known his answer to this question, and Knives has always known his answer to this question. Wolfwood struggled until Volume 8 about if a man could change, and even here, it is debatable about whether or not he is changing into something new, or if he's just being true to who he always was, and it's somewhat open to interpretation. But the point ultimately is that he is trying to be more than he thinks he is, and the series might be suggesting that the effort is ultimately more important than succeeding in that goal. Despite all the praise for the writing I've given this arc, it does have a problem where the flashbacks to earlier volumes are presented with different dialogue from the original scenes, which can make some things like Wolfwood understanding Vash's actions slightly confusing. It's ultimately fine, but it's odd that the message is conveyed through different words, especially as Justin Burns translated the first 9 volumes of this series before the company in charge of the lettering, Studio Cutie, took over the roles for volumes 10 and 11, before Matthew Johnson eventually took over translation for the rest of the series. This fault and all of the other weaknesses found in the action set pieces throughout the series notwithstanding, the ending of this arc, from the final blows to the consequences to the somber yet relaxed closing pages, highlight that the character arc at the core of Wolfwood's story is excellent. From the end of the original series, through the whole of Maximum, into this arc especially. The ending is exactly what it needed to be. Shown with art that is lighter than the adventure before it, but with a worn-out bleakness underneath it all. And the emotional fallout at the end, which even references the first volume of Maximum, leaves the series in the perfect place to begin its final arc. We will get to that and everything that entails someday, but for now, volumes 9 and 10 of Trigun Maximum are the ideal conclusion to the previous volume's darker tone. If you can tolerate Night Owl's failings as an artist and embrace his strengths, this is a very good 2-part action story with a gloomy atmosphere punctuated by moments of hope. I would recommend reading LR and Wolfwood back to back, possibly alongside Volume 8 Silent Run for the best experience possible. If you like all of the character work Night Owl has done so far, you will love this. It captures so many of the things that make this series interesting and impactful, while also sadly containing some of the niggling deficiencies. Thank you for watching. Good night.